So in this video, what we're going to be looking at the signs of a chemical reaction. So firstly, we need to understand what we mean by a chemical reaction. What you've already seen are a few examples of reactions. But a chemical reaction is when one or more chemicals transforms into entirely new chemicals. And those new chemicals cannot easily be changed back into what you started with. The chemicals that we start with, we call our reactants. They are what are doing the reaction. The chemicals we end up with or finish with are called the products because they are what are produced during the reaction. And anytime we are writing a chemical reaction, we put the reactants on the left-hand side before an arrow and the products on the right-hand side after the arrow. We use an arrow rather than an equal sign to represent that a transformation is happening and that it can only go in one direction. The reactants can transform into the products, but the products cannot go back into the reactants. So always make sure if you're representing a reaction, it needs an arrow in the middle. Now you have seen a few examples of chemical reactions and we've talked about them on previous videos. We've seen a compound be formed. When magnesium was burnt in oxygen, they transformed into magnesium oxide. When we were thinking about breaking a compound, our copper chloride was transformed into copper and chlorine. In each case, the reactants are the things that we start with, magnesium and oxygen for the making a compound, copper chloride for breaking a compound, and the products are what we made at the end of the reaction. So for magnesium and oxygen, we made magnesium oxide. That is our product. When we were breaking down copper chloride, what we made was copper and chlorine, so those were both products. Always reactants before the arrow, an arrow pointing towards the product, and the product on the right-hand side. Now, when a chemical reaction happens, there are ways to tell that it is a reaction and not something that is reversible. So you need to be able to remember signs of chemical reactions. So an obvious one is a color change. If you mix two chemicals together and they change color, that is because a reaction has occurred. You can sometimes get either a solid forming, and we would call that a precipitate, or you can see fizzing or bubbling happening. Either of those, making a solid or making a gas, is another sign of a chemical reaction. We can feel or see energy being given off. So if the reaction heats up or cools down a lot, that is a sign of a chemical reaction. Or if it gives off light, like a firework, or when magnesium is burnt in oxygen and glows bright white, that is light energy being released, which is a good sign of a chemical reaction. And the final one is if you get a change in smell, because that is a transformation. So you need to be able to remember a good number of the different signs for a chemical reaction. And you will be aware of lots of chemical reactions going around you that you might not have been aware were reactions. Some of these are useful. So if you take a car, a bus, a motorbike, or any sort of transport to get to school, the use of petrol or fuel to turn it into energy to drive the car, that is a chemical reaction. Every time you eat, your body does a reaction turning that food into smaller chemicals and getting energy. That's a reaction. And if you are getting acrylic or anything done on your nails where it starts off as a liquid and then hardens, that is a chemical reaction happening as well. We also have lots of reactions that we don't want that go on around us. So when iron rusts, it changes color. That is a chemical reaction, we don't want it. When food starts to rot, it changes color and it starts to smell. Those are signs that that's a chemical reaction. And pollution causing acid rain, that is definitely an unwanted chemical reaction.